Hello, everyone. It's the Grouchy Historian. Here we are, week 6, the final week of the third quarter of our American Constitution course, looking at significant Supreme Court cases throughout history. This week, we're going to tackle the big one. That's right, the Second Amendment. Probably right after the first. It's a tight race between the First and Second Amendment as the most argued about amendments in the Bill of Rights in terms of how many Supreme Court cases we have about this. So let's set the table a little bit here. Keep in mind that there have been a number of cases over the years for all of the amendments of the Bill of Rights, but particularly the first and second, to discuss the question, argue the question, settle the question, as it were. Are there limits to free speech? Are there limits to your ability to keep and bear arms? Now, over the years, there have been Supreme Court cases that have tested and said that, yes, in certain circumstances, the government can, for the public good, for the public safety, set limitations on free speech. Some of you have probably heard the old saying, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? You cannot deliberately incite a riot, deliberately try to go out and start a mob to go kill someone or to start a riot. So there are some very narrow, often argued about limitations on free speech. The same goes with the Second Amendment, right? As I noted here, lawyers, historians, and pundits have literally argued over the placement of a comma, that one right there shown in red, for hundreds of years. The text of the Second Amendment is pretty short. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. For some weird reason, they argue about that first comma. Okay, so this amendment gets a lot of historical attention. Again, this is where you go back to that sort of originalist living. This is probably the amendment where that particular, those particular viewpoints are brought into conflict the most when you look at the Second Amendment. And what was the framers' original intent for writing this? So let's go back, a little history here. Again, the founders wrote the Constitution fairly briefly, including the amendments in the Bill of Rights, because they all knew exactly what they meant. They all knew exactly where they were coming from because they had all lived through it, okay? In colonial days, every male head of household, at a minimum, was required to have a musket and to know how to use them. Now, most of them did anyway because they went hunting for their dinner, but it was a requirement, particularly along the frontier where Native American raids were not uncommon, even if there was no general war on, for every man in the town over the age of, over a certain age, 16, 17, 18, whatever it was, to have a musket and to show up for drill at certain designated times from the town government to provide common security for the town. We still see this today in some countries. Switzerland, for example, yes, every household is required to have a military-grade weapon. Okay, so this is not, again, sort of this ahistorical, wild and crazy thing. Now, what we have seen in recent years is a lot of attention on what exactly militia means, right? You will find that some people argue whenever they have some sort of gun rights case, as they tend to be called in the Second Amendment, say, well, we have a well-regulated militia. That's the National Guard, and only the National Guard should have certain kinds of weapons. And, you know, the biggest argument that we've had over the Second Amendment recently is, does the Second Amendment give you as an individual, not necessarily a member of a well-regulated militia, the right to keep and bear arms? So the two cases we're going to look at this week are DC, the District of Columbia versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago. These are very similar cases, okay? In fact, McDonald versus Chicago was sort of the sequel to Heller versus DC. And in recent years, again, Heller versus DC was settled in 2008, was probably one of the most significant gun rights cases in quite a while. Now, over the years, there have been some limits placed on the ownership of guns. For example, you're not allowed to own a machine gun, okay? Again, there is, you know, some level of what you would call common sense gun control. Now, of course, that's one of those terms that is fairly amorphous and highly politicized. But over the years, the Supreme Court has held that Congress has certain powers to regulate certain types of firearms. Again, it is currently illegal to own a fully automatic weapon like a machine gun. Again, there are, of course, always exceptions to the rules. Certain heavily regulated, federally licensed firearms dealers do own those for purposes of gun shows and demonstrations, etc. Yes, I know. But for the most part, you're not going to see somebody mounting a machine gun on their truck driving down the highway, right? Okay. Second thing, the Supreme Court has recognized Congress and to a certain extent some state government ability to regulate the sale and manufacture of firearms, right? This is where we get into the perennial discussion over, if you've watched the news, you probably heard about background checks, universal background checks at gun shows, etc., etc., etc. We're going to discuss those and do some more research on those when we get into the next quarter. But for the most part, that over the years, the court has issued a number of rulings regarding what governments can and can't do to regulating the sale, ownership, possession, transfer, etc. of firearms. Okay. In these two particular cases, the issue before the court was whether someone could own a firearm in their home for home defense. And in both cases, the court sided with the plaintiffs that yes, indeed, the Second Amendment to the Constitution does give the individual right to own a gun. Seems pretty straightforward. Yet it's not, because there are always court cases coming up almost every year, same thing with abortion, on gun rights, because opinion here, politicians have a tendency when crime gets out of control, usually either to their own ineptitude or bad decisions, to blame guns, right? Let's just be honest. Every time there's some crazy mass shooting, politicians tend to blame guns, forgetting, of course, that the investigations almost inevitably show that either some law enforcement agency missed something, in my observation, or gun laws were followed to the letter and that particular individual still managed to obtain a gun. So it's not a matter of more laws, perhaps, but perhaps enforcing the laws that exist. Again, this is something that you can research in the fourth quarter when you do your own research into the current state of the gun argument. Of course, one of the most controversial recent issues regarding the ownership of firearms is what are so-called red flag laws. And I'll let you research those a little bit more in the fourth quarter as well. Just know that this is a topic that is likely to continue forever, because the Second Amendment is on its face pretty clear. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Not necessarily unlimited, but the individual right to individually own a firearm for self-defense, for sport, for whatever reason you want, is indeed protected by the Second Amendment, okay? Now, we've come to the end of the second quarter. I know there's been a lot to take in, and some of these cases were a little difficult to sort through, so I appreciate the effort that I'm sure all of you had to put in to do so. But as we go into exam week, all right, again, this is sort of intended to be a cumulative course, so keep in mind everything that you've learned this particular quarter, because next quarter, we're going to get into you. It's going to be all about you, right? I've tried to design this course to hopefully provide a little education, provide some background on the Constitution, a little bit of constitutional law, some significant Supreme Court cases, all of it looking toward the application of how it affects you in your life right now. And then the next quarter, you're going to have the opportunity to do your own research and start forming even more your own opinion on some of these controversial topics of the day. So good luck on your exam next week, and we'll see you in the fourth quarter.